January 1944. The western Pacific lies silent beneath a ceiling of low gray clouds. A formation of Japanese reconnaissance planes, twin-engine Mitsubishi G4M Bettys, cuts across the horizon at 8,000 feet. Their radar screens hum faintly in the dim light of the cockpit. Below, a cluster of faint dots flickers across the display. A convoy, moving slow and steady. To the flight commander, Lieutenant Masao Tanaka, it looks like a perfect target. A chain of transports, likely heading toward the Marianas, maybe even the Philippines. He orders his navigator to mark the bearings. Then, within minutes, the signal weakens. The dots break apart, and in the soft glow of the radar scope, they vanish completely. No static, no interference, no storm to explain it. Just silence. The pilots stare in disbelief. The ocean below looks calm, empty, endless. Tanaka circles once, scanning the waves for any sign of movement. But the radar remains blank. For hours afterward, his squadron reports the same confusion to base, and receives only static in return. None of them know it yet. But what they witnessed wasn't a mirage. It was America's new secret: radar deception at sea. By early 1944, the Pacific had become a vast arena of technology, endurance, and invisible warfare. The age of the battleship was fading. The age of radar had begun. What once depended on sight and instinct now revolved around invisible waves pulsing through the sky. Signals that could find fleets hundreds of miles away, detect bombers through storm clouds, and guide fighters through darkness. Japan, once confident in its naval reach, was falling behind in this unseen war. The Imperial Navy's early advantage in the Pacific, bold carrier strikes, well-trained aviators, and disciplined coordination, was being steadily undone by an American machine built on science and industry. While Japan relied on courage, America relied on laboratories. Radar, radio, and electronic detection became the quiet weapons that would change everything. Throughout 1943, Allied radar networks grew from isolated field experiments into continent-wide systems. On islands like Guadalcanal and Bougainville, new radar stations appeared almost overnight. Strange steel towers rising from jungles, guarded by engineers in khaki rather than infantrymen with rifles. American radar, with its distinctive rotating dishes and cathode green screens, could track aircraft and ships at distances that seemed impossible to Japanese crews still. Working with vacuum tube receivers of pre-war design, the U.S. Navy called its innovation chain the Combat Information Center, CIC, a room hidden deep within every major ship, where sailors hunched over radar scopes in total darkness. Inside these secret compartments, a new kind of warfare was unfolding. Silent, electronic, and precise. By the end of 1943, American convoys could move through open ocean under near-total radio silence. Orders were passed by light signals, prearranged routes, and coded bursts so brief that Japanese listeners couldn't even register them. Meanwhile, Japan's own detection network was faltering. Its coastal radar installations struggled to coordinate with aircraft. Data arrived late, fragmented, and often inaccurate. Even when Japanese radar spotted incoming bombers or convoys, there were few trained operators who could interpret the returns with confidence. The Imperial Navy's focus on traditional gunnery and air power left its radar programs underfunded and fragmented. A fatal oversight in a war increasingly fought in wavelengths and reflections. In response, American engineers began to exploit a crucial weakness: the predictability of Japanese radar. Through intercepted signals, U.S. intelligence learned that Japanese systems relied on fixed frequencies, narrow bands easily disrupted or fooled. That knowledge inspired the creation of electronic deception units, small groups of technicians aboard escort ships and carriers whose sole purpose was to make the enemy see what wasn't there, or miss what was. One of the simplest yet most effective tools was chaff, codenamed window. Strips of aluminum foil, cut to precise lengths, were dumped from aircraft or ships to create phantom blips on enemy radar screens. To Japanese operators, these false echoes appeared as entire formations of planes or convoys. Pilots were sent to intercept mirages, wasting fuel and time while real American fleets slipped quietly past. Yet deception wasn't limited to clutter. The U.S. Navy developed radar decoy buoys, floating transmitters designed to imitate the radar profile of a destroyer or transport ship. Deployed in clusters, they could draw Japanese reconnaissance aircraft away from true convoys. To the untrained eye, a cluster of radar returns moving in formation seemed entirely genuine. And when Japanese pilots approached for visual confirmation, they found only open water. By the beginning of 1944, the Japanese High Command had begun to suspect something was wrong. Reconnaissance flights frequently reported convoys that vanished mid-route. Radar stations in the Bonin Islands logged ghost fleets that appeared and dissolved without warning. Some officers blamed weather interference. Others believed the Americans had invented a new type of radar, stealth. In truth, the answer lay in the marriage of silence and deception. The American doctrine that what can't be heard can't be hit. Every American ship was now trained in MCON, emissions control. No unnecessary radio transmissions, no radar sweeps unless ordered. Even internal ship communication used wired phones and signal lamps. Convoys became silent fleets, moving like shadows through the Pacific, protected by both technology and discipline. And as the Japanese sought to recover their fading advantage, they would soon meet these invisible convoys again, this time under the burning skies of the Philippine Sea. In the early months of 1944, the Pacific War entered its second industrial phase, a contest not of heroism, but of systems. While Japanese commanders still spoke in the language of courage and spirit, American planners spoke in the language of frequencies, decibels, and signal strength. What had begun as a war of ships and men was becoming a war of circuits and silence. Behind the scenes, a quiet revolution was taking place in American naval laboratories, particularly at the Naval Research Laboratory, NRL, in Washington, D.C., and the Radiation Laboratory at MIT. There, engineers in white coats designed compact radar sets like the SG Surface Search Radar, small enough to fit on destroyers and submarines. These devices gave U.S. convoys eyes that could see through fog, darkness, and distance. But radar alone wasn't enough. It needed protection. Every transmission risked betrayal, a signal that Japanese receivers could detect and triangulate. Thus was born the second layer of defense, deception. Instead of simply hiding, America learned how to mislead. By mid-1944, entire teams known as countermeasures units operated aboard escort ships. They studied enemy radar patterns, recorded signal intercepts, and devised ways to reflect, distort, or mimic them. The results were astonishing. With little more than strips of foil, tuned transmitters, and precise timing, they could make convoys disappear or appear where none existed. The first large-scale trials took place around the Solomon Islands and New Guinea, where Japanese air patrols remained active. Convoys carrying fuel, ammunition, and men to forward bases were the lifeblood of the Allied advance, and thus the most vulnerable targets. On radar, their long, slow-moving lines of echoes made easy prey. But with decoys, they could scatter their electronic signature across hundreds of miles. In one test recorded by U.S. Pacific Fleet archives, a group of radar buoys was dropped in a broad arc several miles north of a real convoy. Hours later, Japanese reconnaissance aircraft pursued those false echoes, diving on an empty patch of ocean. Meanwhile, the genuine convoy steamed safely south, unseen and unheard. The Japanese after-action report simply read, Target lost due to atmospheric disturbance. This growing confusion spread across the Imperial command chain. Tokyo's Naval Intelligence Section began to receive conflicting reports. Radar sightings without confirmation. Coordinates that led to empty seas. Commanders blamed inexperienced pilots, faulty instruments, even supernatural phenomena. The phrase ghost convoys began appearing in radio logs, a bitter acknowledgement of something beyond their understanding. At the same time, America's industrial advantage was magnifying every success. For every Japanese radar set, the U.S. Navy built 10. For every damaged convoy, 3 more sailed behind it. Factories in California, New Jersey, and Illinois ran around the clock producing not only aircraft and ships, but also thousands of radar tubes, oscillators, and antenna arrays. The technology that once required entire rooms could now fit inside a bomber's nose cone. Japanese radar, by contrast, lagged years behind. The Type 21 and Type 22 ship radars, Japan's main operational models, suffered from low power and poor resolution. They could detect large formations but not distinguish real convoys from decoys. Operators received little training, often treating the devices as unreliable supplements rather than essential tools. When Allied cryptographers began decoding Japanese communications in late 1943, they saw the uncertainty spreading. Field commanders demanded better detection gear. Naval engineers pleaded for time and resources. But time was the one thing Japan no longer had. America's technological curve was exponential, and every convoy that vanished off Japanese screens made that reality harder to deny. By the summer of 1944, deception had evolved from a defensive tactic into a weapon of strategy. During operations supporting the invasions of Saipan, Guam, and later Leyte, American radar countermeasures allowed massive naval movements to proceed virtually undetected, until it was too late for Japan to respond effectively. The stage was now set for one of the most remarkable confrontations of the Pacific Air War, when Japanese pilots, trained to trust their instruments above all else, would once again chase a phantom fleet through clouds and chaos. They would return to base shaken, confused, and disbelieving, unaware that what they had seen was not an illusion of weather or fate, but a deliberate trick born from America's mastery of invisible warfare. Angle 1. The Japanese eyes in the sky. By 1944, the Japanese Navy's aerial reconnaissance units were stretched thin across an ocean too vast to monitor. Their mission was simple in theory: find, report, and shadow Allied convoys. But in practice, it was an impossible task. The Pacific stretched over 60 million square miles, and radar coverage was patchy at best. From bases in Truk, Palau, and Iwo Jima, reconnaissance squadrons of Mitsubishi G4M, Betty, and Kawanishi H-8K, Emily flying boats flew long, lonely routes across the open ocean. They depended on primitive radar sets and visual spotting, eyes straining for specks of movement, flashes of sunlight on metal, or faint traces on green radar screens. Japanese pilots had learned to trust their instruments after years of maritime patrols. But in 1944, something began to erode that trust. Radar blips that once seemed reliable were now vanishing mid-patrol. Entire convoys disappeared from scope, sometimes reappearing hundreds of miles away or splitting into multiple ghost signatures. Flight logs show notes scrawled in disbelief. Contact lost, without cause. The Japanese believed they were witnessing malfunctions or atmospheric effects, what they called sea mirages. In truth, they were watching the evolution of American radar countermeasures, a new art of illusion that made the ocean itself an accomplice. Angle 2. America's technicians of silence far from the front lines. In quiet compartments deep inside escort carriers and destroyers, A different kind of warrior worked in near darkness. They were the U.S. Navy's electronic countermeasures specialists, men with no guns, trained not in shooting, but in silence. Surrounded by humming equipment, they studied Japanese radar frequencies captured by signals intelligence units. Every pulse, every repetition, was logged and analyzed. Once a pattern was known, it could be copied, bent, or buried. To these technicians, deception was an engineering problem. How to make one echo look like 10. How to make 10 disappear like smoke. Their tools were deceptively simple. Tuned transmitters, foil strips, reflectors, and coded emitters. They could blanket an area with false targets or hide real ones behind a wall of electronic noise. On board the escort carrier USS White Plains, one report noted, "Enemy aircraft broke formation after chaff deployment. No attack followed." It wasn't a coincidence. American convoys now carried specialized countermeasure pods capable of scattering radar-reflective material into the wind. From above, these drifting clouds appeared as solid formations, entire fleets sailing where none existed. The more advanced ships carried floating decoys equipped with simple pulse generators, imitating destroyer radar returns. The U.S. Navy's philosophy was elegant. The less the enemy knows, the less he can strike. By embracing silence and precision, American fleets became ghosts in an ocean where visibility once meant survival. Angle 3. The psychological shock for Japanese pilots. Radar had been a source of pride, proof of Japan's modernity and its scientific discipline. But by 1944, every new encounter with the Americans revealed something unnerving. Convoys that disappeared were one thing. Convoys that appeared in the wrong place were worse. Pilots reported seeing fleets where none existed. Patrol planes shadowed American task forces that evaporated into thin air, leaving fuel tanks empty and crews bewildered. After several such incidents, the Imperial Navy's Intelligence Division launched internal inquiries. They concluded that enemy interference was possible, though not yet proven. But on the front lines, the men didn't need official explanations. They could see it in the pattern: each failed contact, each wasted mission, each false alarm. Something was systematically blinding them. One Japanese radar officer later described the feeling, "It was as if the Americans could turn the ocean on and off. Our machines no longer told the truth." That loss of trust was devastating. In warfare, morale doesn't always break from defeat in battle. Sometimes it shatters in confusion. The once proud pilots of Japan's naval air arm began to doubt their equipment, their intelligence, even their own eyes. And every moment of doubt meant slower response times, more errors, and greater opportunities for the U.S. fleet to strike unopposed. Angle 4. The tactical transformation, radar deception, didn't only protect convoys, it changed the very rhythm of naval warfare. Before 1943, convoy defense relied heavily on destroyer screens and air cover. Engagements were physical and immediate, ships firing on visible threats. By 1944, the battlefield had moved into the ether. Instead of waiting to intercept attackers, American task forces preemptively erased themselves from the enemy's radar horizon. Decoy buoys, false signals, and radar quiet routes turned the Pacific into a maze of illusions. Japanese reconnaissance had no stable reference points. Convoy routes that once seemed predictable now shifted nightly according to weather and radar coverage forecasts. Even American submarines, notorious for their bold independent patrols, began to coordinate with radar deception units. Fake transmissions and radar noise masked their approach to Japanese supply convoys, ensuring that the enemy's escorts were drawn toward phantom contacts elsewhere. Every deception operation became a small act of strategy, a blend of intelligence, timing, and psychology. By the end of 1944, deception was no longer experimental. It was doctrine. Entire fleets moved under the cover of electromagnetic camouflage. proving that victory wasn't just about power, it was about perception. And soon, one of these carefully orchestrated illusions would lead to the most bewildering encounter yet, when an entire Japanese squadron would chase ghosts across the Philippine Sea. Angle 5, the engineers behind the illusion in war. Not all heroes carried rifles. Some carried oscilloscopes and soldering irons. Hidden behind locked laboratory doors from San Diego to Pearl Harbor, engineers built the quiet foundation of America's invisible fleets. These men and women, many drawn from civilian universities, worked on the cutting edge of radio physics. Their goal wasn't destruction, but disappearance. At the Naval Research Laboratory, specialists under Dr. Robert Page and his colleagues refined pulse modulation systems to fool enemy radar returns. At the Massachusetts Institute of Technology Radiation Laboratory, mathematicians calculated exactly how long a radar pulse must be delayed to appear as something else. A decoy echo drifting miles away from its true source. The concept was simple in theory: radar deception through timing. In practice, it was a masterpiece of precision. 1 microsecond of delay could shift a target's apparent position by hundreds of yards. Combined with floating transmitters and reflective balloons, it created moving illusions that radar operators found indistinguishable from real ships. While combat pilots and sailors rarely knew their names, these engineers changed the shape of every engagement that followed. A single frequency chart, smuggled out through signal intercepts, could protect a convoy of thousands. Every breakthrough, every new technique, meant another night that a fleet could travel unseen. And as the Pacific tide turned, their invisible fingerprints appeared in every victory report. Angle 6, the art of discipline. The U.S. Navy's new warfare required not just technology, but restraint. Silence became an art form. Every sailor, every operator, was trained to think before pressing a transmitter key or radar switch. In convoy briefings, captains reminded their crews, "One stray signal can light up the ocean." It wasn't easy. Ships depended on coordination, and silence felt unnatural in a world that ran on orders and reports. Yet by 1944, American fleets had mastered the rhythm of stillness. Flagships communicated by blinker lights. Submarines signaled surfacing schedules with prearranged patterns of light flashes, barely visible against the sea. Even aircraft approaching carriers at night used coded light beacons instead of radio calls. This doctrine, MCON, or emissions control, became the soul of radar deception. If the enemy could not hear, he could not hunt. When combined with decoy transmitters and chaff screens, MCON turned the U.S. Navy into a phantom force, gliding through the Pacific like ghosts behind curtains of static. It was this combination of silence and simulation that the Japanese could never match. Their fleet still relied on radio coordination, their aircraft still reported targets in open voice transmissions. American signals units often intercepted these calls, knowing exactly where Japanese planes were searching and adjusting their decoy deployments in real time. To the Japanese, the Americans seemed to vanish and reappear at will. To the Americans, it was simply discipline executed with mathematical precision. Angle 7, the enemy's perspective. Inside Japanese intelligence headquarters at Yokosuka, frustration was turning into alarm. Field reports from radar operators and pilots contradicted each other daily. Convoys sighted off Palau failed to appear off Guam. Task forces tracked near Leyte never materialized. Senior officers began to suspect deliberate interference. In late 1944, a classified internal report titled "On the Disappearance of Enemy Fleets" was circulated among the Imperial Navy's technical staff. It admitted, for the first time, that the enemy may possess electronic weapons designed to obscure or multiply radar reflections. The conclusion was chilling. The possibility exists that our instruments are being deceived. But there was little Japan could do. With its electronics industry crippled by bombing and resource shortages, new radar development slowed to a crawl. Engineers lacked critical materials like copper, quartz, and high-quality vacuum tubes. And with U.S. submarines cutting supply routes from Southeast Asia, even experimental components often never reached their destination. Japanese radar crews were left to improvise. Some attempted manual filtering, tuning out what they believed were false echoes. Others relied solely on visual confirmation, flying dangerously low through storms to spot American convoys with the naked eye. Many of those flights never returned. The Imperial Navy had entered a battle it could not see, fought with weapons it did not understand. Angle 8. The ethical frontier, even among American officers, there were quiet discussions about what radar deception meant for the nature of warfare. Was it honorable to win through illusion? Traditionalists, steeped in the values of decisive battle, viewed deception as unworthy of a navy built on courage. Yet younger officers, raised on science and modern tactics, saw it differently. To them, deception was survival. It saved ships, men, and time. It turned risk into advantage, uncertainty into control. And, as Admiral Raymond Spruance once remarked in a private briefing, "If the enemy chooses to see ghosts, we will give him plenty." By late 1944, those ghosts were everywhere, across the Marianas, the Philippine Sea, and the routes to Okinawa. Every false signal, every decoy buoy, was a statement of dominance. America's ability to control not only the battlefield, but also the perception of it. The Japanese didn't yet know it. But the next major encounter, their largest air operation of the Pacific, would reveal just how blind they had become. The silent convoys would move again, invisible yet unstoppable. And in their wake, Japan's faith in its machines would collapse for good. The day the ocean lied. June 1944, the Philippine Sea stretched like a sheet of molten glass beneath the rising sun. Far to the east, dozens of Japanese reconnaissance aircraft fanned out in search of the American fleet. Operation Ago, Japan's desperate plan to repel the U.S. invasion of the Marianas, was underway. Their mission: locate and destroy the invasion convoys before they reached Saipan. But what they found, or thought they found, would only deepen Japan's confusion. Shortly after 0700 hours on June 18th, a radar operator aboard a Japanese Kawanishi H-8K patrol flying boat detected a large cluster of echoes roughly 250 miles northwest of Guam. The returns were strong and steady, the perfect profile of an American convoy. The signal showed multiple large vessels, consistent with transport ships escorted by destroyers. The pilot, Lieutenant Ichiro Miyasaka, immediately transmitted the coordinates to command. Within minutes, strike aircraft from the carrier Shokaku were scrambled to intercept. As the Japanese formation approached, the radar contact began to distort. The blips split apart, multiplied, then slowly drifted westward, in a direction no convoy could possibly travel, given known currents and wind. The formation leader checked his bearings twice. The radar still showed dozens of echoes, but when they broke through the cloud layer, the sea below was empty. No ships, no smoke, no wake trails, only scattered whitecaps glinting in the sunlight. Unbeknownst to them, the Americans had already left the area. Shielded by radar silence and covered by Operation Nimitz Ghost, a classified countermeasure exercise being conducted by the U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet. To mask the departure of real invasion convoys heading for Saipan, American escort ships had deployed hundreds of Mark 33 radar decoy buoys and released tons of chaff, forming a false electronic fleet drifting slowly west. The Japanese had found it perfectly. By 0830 hours, the Japanese strike force, still believing they were closing in on a real target, descended to attack altitude. But the only thing they saw was the vast, shimmering Pacific. Confusion set in, then panic. Fuel gauges were dropping fast. Several pilots suggested mechanical failure. Others believed the Americans were using wave reflection to bend radar signals. An impossible theory, but one born of desperation. Back at command, reports came flooding in. Convoy sighted, bearing 285 degrees. Contact lost. Multiple signals now appearing south of Saipan. Each message contradicted the last. Within 2 hours, Japanese radar networks were in disarray. Commanders aboard Ozawa's mobile fleet received overlapping coordinates from 3 different patrol sectors, none of which matched. Believing that the Americans had split into multiple groups, Ozawa diverted his limited air squadrons in several directions, effectively fragmenting his own offensive strength before the battle had even begun. Meanwhile, the true U.S. invasion convoys, under Vice Admiral Richmond Turner, continued their steady approach toward Saipan, undetected, shielded by a wall of false radar echoes drifting hundreds of miles away. The deception worked perfectly. At noon, American codebreakers monitoring Japanese communications intercepted a confused burst of messages. Multiple enemy fleets sighted. Interception impossible. They knew then that the Japanese had swallowed the bait whole. Hours later, the consequences became devastatingly clear. When the Japanese air arm launched its massive strike, more than 300 aircraft in total, most headed toward the Phantom radar contacts. Those who reached the Decoy area found only ocean and wind. By the time they turned back, they had burned through fuel reserves. Dozens crashed into the sea before ever engaging. A single American ship. The few that stumbled upon the real U.S. task. Force were met by radar-guided anti-aircraft fire. A storm of precision that shredded the attack before it could even form. The Americans would later call it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. But beneath the spectacle of air combat was the quieter, deadlier victory. The success of radar deception that had fractured Japan's ability to see. Japanese after-action reports later tried to rationalize the disaster. They blamed equipment instability, temperature distortion, and imperfect wave calibration. But the truth was simpler. Their instruments had told them lies, and they had believed every word. For the Japanese pilots who returned to base, the shock ran deep. They had trusted their radar, their training, and their nation's technology, only to discover that the Americans had mastered not just the art of detection, but the art of disappearance. In that moment, the Pacific changed forever. The ocean itself had become a weapon, and the empire that once ruled it by sight and daring was now flying blind. The Ghost Fleet strikes back. By late June 1944, the deception was no longer an experiment. It was an operational weapon. Admiral Raymond Spruance and his intelligence teams understood the psychological terrain of warfare as much as the physical one. The Japanese believed deeply in visual confirmation. The pilot's eye, the sailor's binocular, the commander's instinct. Radar was a newer instrument, still treated with caution and even suspicion by some in the Imperial Navy. The Americans would exploit that hesitation completely. The U.S. Navy's deception effort expanded across the theater. Escort destroyers and specially equipped decoy vessels deployed from Saipan's staging area to form radar mirages. They released aluminum-coated balloons, reflective foil clouds, and remote drifting transmitters that mimicked the pulse signatures of troop carriers. Some even broadcast faint radio chatter in Japanese Morse to mimic fleet coordination. Each of these tactics fed into the illusion of an armada, and each drew Japanese reconnaissance aircraft further away from the real invasion paths. On June 19th, at precisely 09:45 hours, Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's radar officers aboard the carrier Zuikaku reported another confirmed convoy southwest of Tinian. What they didn't know was that the signal came from a chain of 6 American destroyers deploying Mark 33 decoy buoys, each one tuned to resonate just above the radar frequency used by Japanese search planes. The result was an amplified cluster of dots, almost indistinguishable from a genuine fleet. Ozawa's staff urged immediate attack. Believing the Americans were divided into smaller invasion elements, he launched what he called Second Phase Wave. It would be the largest air deployment Japan had left, more than 250 aircraft, their remaining trained pilots among them. By mid-morning, U.S. Navy radar operators aboard the carriers Lexington and Enterprise detected the inbound Japanese formations over 300 miles out. Thanks to captured intelligence and previous code breaking, Spruance already knew the decoys had succeeded. The Americans were ready. Their combat air patrols positioned, anti-aircraft systems warmed, radar scopes glowing with precision. For the next several hours, the sky above the Philippine Sea turned into a killing ground. Wave after wave of Japanese aircraft dove toward phantom coordinates, their fuel rapidly depleting, their targets non-existent. Those who veered toward the real U.S. fleet were cut down by layers of Hellcats and flak bursts that turned the sky into molten steel. By sunset, more than 300 Japanese aircraft had been destroyed. The Imperial Navy lost almost all of its remaining carrier pilots in a single day. And yet, the most critical blow was invisible: the complete erosion of Japan's confidence in radar. Post-battle communications revealed an emerging paranoia among air and fleet commanders. Some now believed the Americans could manipulate the ether, bending the very waves used for detection. Others ordered their radar operators to rely only on visual sightings, a fatal decision in a theater defined by distance and weather. The Americans, meanwhile, perfected their technique. During subsequent operations in the Marianas and later in the Leyte Gulf campaign, radar deception became routine. Destroyer escorts dropped metallic chaff in coordinated sweeps, creating entire phantom convoys stretching across hundreds of miles. Pilots from the Japanese Army Air Force, flying from remote island bases, would scramble toward shadows on their scopes, only to find nothing but ocean. Each false pursuit drained their fuel, their machines, and their morale. By early July, intercepted Japanese radio messages revealed a chilling pattern. Reports of convoys that never existed. Warnings of fleets that vanished. Entire sectors described as ghost waters. America's mastery of radar was no longer just technological. It was psychological warfare at its most elegant form. For Lieutenant Tanaka, the same pilot who, months earlier, had first witnessed the disappearing convoy, the lesson became clear. In a letter recovered after the war, he wrote, "We were blind, even as we believed we could see. The ocean reflected back our arrogance. It showed us only what we wanted to find." That reflection captured the essence of Japan's unraveling position in 1944. Superior courage, unmatched devotion, but outclassed by science. For the first time, the empire of the rising sun faced an enemy that could vanish at will, not through speed or stealth, but through manipulation of perception itself. When the Battle of the Philippine Sea ended, the Imperial Navy had lost 3 carriers, hundreds of planes, and its last hope of air parity. The Americans advanced toward Saipan unchallenged, their radar deception having paved the way for invasion. Not through force of arms, but through illusion and patience. The turning point had arrived. Japan still held vast territories, but the balance had shifted irreversibly. From that day onward, the Pacific would belong not to those who could see the farthest, but to those who could disappear most effectively. Echoes of defeat. In the days following the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the vast stretch of ocean west of the Marianas became eerily quiet. Oil slicks drifted across the waves, reflecting the first calm sunlight after the chaos. The Americans called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a grim nickname that captured the scale of Japan's loss. More than 600 enemy aircraft destroyed, 3 carriers crippled, and with them, the last backbone of Japan's naval aviation. But while history would record those numbers, what went largely unseen was the invisible weapon that had shaped the outcome long before the first dogfight began: radar deception. In war diaries and after-action reports, American officers described how ghost fleets drew Japanese planes into the open. One task force commander noted that enemy squadrons attacked coordinates where no ships existed, pursuing shadows through empty air. It was, for the first time, a triumph not of brute force, but of electromagnetic control, the mastery of what the Japanese later called Maboroshi no Senshi, the Phantom War. For Admiral Spruance, this was the proof that technology could redefine strategy. The fleet's combat reports were filled with data from decoy experiments, radar sweeps, echo patterns, jamming effects. Analysts at Pearl Harbor compiled these into what became known as Operation Counterbeam, a classified project to standardize American radar deception across the Pacific. Destroyer squadrons were retrained to deploy chaff patterns in formation. Aircraft were equipped with transmitters to simulate convoy chatter, and shore stations developed phantom signatures to mask real troop movements. The results were extraordinary. By autumn 1944, when General Douglas MacArthur prepared his return to the Philippines, Japanese radar operators could no longer distinguish between real and false fleets. Their screens were flooded with noise, too many signals, too many ghosts. It forced commanders to rely on human scouts, stretching their reconnaissance wings to exhaustion and exposing them to American ambushes. The war's balance had shifted in more ways than one. The United States had learned that domination in modern conflict meant not only destroying the enemy's machines, but dismantling his confidence in what he perceived as reality. Every false echo, every phantom convoy, widened that psychological wound. Meanwhile, in Japan, the tone of military briefings darkened. Engineers from the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal dissected wrecked American equipment and captured radar fragments, searching for the secret behind the deception. Their findings were unsettling. They discovered that the Americans were using radar frequencies that could be intentionally reflected and manipulated, something Japan's systems were not yet capable of adjusting for. In simple terms, the Japanese were fighting blind in a war of invisible light. Internal memoranda from July 1944 reveal a growing panic. Enemy has achieved total command of detection. Our instruments no longer trust the sea. Some commanders even suggested grounding all radar operations at night to avoid ghost interference. Others began ordering manual confirmation by scout aircraft before any engagement, a delay that often cost them precious hours. The technological gap had become a chasm. While Japan struggled to protect its ships from detection, the United States was already using radar as a weapon, bending, distorting, and deceiving through it. On the ground, the psychological effects rippled through the ranks. Japanese pilots who returned from empty missions spoke of being chased by ghosts. Mechanics began marking planes with talismans against radar trickery. In debriefs, one pilot admitted, "The Americans hide behind nothing. They are everywhere and nowhere." Even senior officers, such as Admiral Minaichi Koga before his death, had warned about the coming war of signals. But by mid-1944, those warnings had materialized too late. The Japanese Navy, once the world's most formidable, was now fighting an opponent it could barely detect, let alone destroy. For the Americans, the aftermath of this victory was not celebration, but evolution. Research into radar and counter-radar systems accelerated. Laboratories in San Diego, Pearl Harbor, and Boston began developing the next generation of deceptive systems, including frequency-hopping transmitters and passive radar reflectors. The same technology that fooled Japanese pilots in 1944 would soon be used in Europe against the Germans during Operation Glimmer and Operation Taxable, the decoy missions for D-Day. The war had entered a new phase, one where the truth of what existed could no longer be trusted. And for the Japanese Navy, still patrolling the shrinking perimeter of its empire, every signal on the radar became a question. Was it a fleet? Or another illusion? Lessons of the Invisible War. By August 1944, the Pacific Ocean had turned into an electromagnetic battlefield. The Japanese Empire, once guided by its proud doctrine of Kantai-Kessen, the decisive fleet engagement, now found itself unable to even locate its enemy. Each new encounter revealed the same haunting pattern. Radar contacts that dissolved into silence, formations that split and reappeared hundreds of miles away, convoys that never existed at all. American naval intelligence intercepted panicked reports from Japanese commanders who described phantom fleets haunting the Philippine Sea. A decoded message from the carrier Chaitos warned, "Enemy uses light itself as camouflage." Another, from the destroyer Nowaki, read simply, "We attack shadows." Behind those poetic fragments lay the truth of a nation at technological breaking point. In Tokyo, senior officers of the Imperial Navy convened emergency meetings to assess the catastrophe. The loss of radar reliability meant the loss of coordination. Ships no longer trusted their instruments. Air wings flew without electronic guidance. The Empire's once feared reconnaissance network, spanning the Marianas, Palau, and Truk, began to unravel. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, who had succeeded Koga, demanded a comprehensive countermeasure program. But Japan's industrial base was collapsing under American bombing. Radar research facilities at Yokohama and Kobe had been destroyed. Scientists lacked copper, precision equipment, even stable power supplies. By contrast, the Americans were producing radar sets by the tens of thousands, compact, powerful, and increasingly sophisticated. The technological imbalance grew into strategic dominance. When the Americans advanced toward the Philippines that October, they no longer needed numerical superiority to ensure victory. They could simply manipulate perception, appearing where they were not and vanishing where they were. Radar deception also had a secondary consequence. It reshaped how intelligence officers viewed warfare itself. Where once the battlefield was measured in miles of ocean or number of ships, it was now measured in data, frequencies, wavelengths, and signal strength. It was the birth of what modern analysts would call information warfare. Reports compiled by the U.S. Office of Naval Research after the war confirmed the psychological devastation caused by radar deception. Many Japanese officers described mental fatigue, the exhaustion of chasing illusions, the inability to distinguish real threats from phantom ones. Pilots returned from missions without finding a single enemy ship. Anti-air batteries wasted ammunition on radar ghosts, and morale, already strained by the relentless American advance, began to fracture. The human side of the war revealed the deeper cost. Captured Japanese radar operators later told U.S. interrogators that they had grown afraid of their own screens. "We could no longer trust the machine," one said. Every light could mean nothing. It was, in essence, the collapse of faith. In technology, a devastating blow for a nation that had prided itself on precision and discipline. Meanwhile, in the United States, success bred further innovation. The Naval Research Laboratory and MIT's Radiation Laboratory refined the techniques pioneered in the Marianas Campaign. The concept of electronic countermeasures, or ECM, was formalized into doctrine. The U.S. Navy now understood that control of the electromagnetic spectrum could decide the outcome of any engagement even before the first shot was fired. By the end of 1944, the Ghost Fleet operations had expanded beyond radar. False radio, transmissions, pre-recorded Morse chatter, even heat signatures were used to mislead Japanese detection units. Entire task forces could appear to exist through radio illusion alone. Japan's once proud air fleets, depleted and desperate, resorted increasingly to toko, suicide missions, in part because conventional targeting had become unreliable. Radar deception had not only blinded the enemy, it had forced them into a strategy of last resort. The Pacific War was now being fought in two dimensions: the visible, where ships clashed and bombs fell, and the invisible, where perception itself became a weapon. In the months that followed, U.S. Command integrated radar deception into nearly every naval operation. From Iwo Jima to Okinawa, phantom fleets continued to lead Japanese defenders astray, splitting their already limited forces. Every misdirected response, every false alarm, accelerated the collapse of Japan's defensive grid. By the time atomic fire consumed Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, the Japanese military was not only defeated in material terms, it was dismantled in mind and method. The Americans had proven that the greatest victories were sometimes won without being seen at all. The sea that once hid Japan's power had become the mirror of its downfall. Vast, silent, and filled with echoes of enemies that never were. And somewhere in that silence, the lessons of radar deception lingered. A warning for the next generation of warfare, that the line between truth and illusion, once crossed, could never again be cleanly drawn. The war you couldn't see. When the guns of the Pacific finally fell silent in August 1945, the world emerged into a new kind of understanding. One where victory was no longer defined solely by ships sunk or cities captured, but by control of the invisible. Radar deception, once a desperate improvisation of engineers and sailors, had rewritten the rules of modern warfare. It proved that information could be weaponized, that sight itself could be manipulated, and that perception, not firepower, could determine who lived and who died. For the Americans, it was the triumph of intellect and industry. A nation of inventors, scientists, and engineers had turned equations and radio waves into shields more powerful than armor. What began as an experiment to protect convoys had evolved into a doctrine that shaped the entire future of military strategy. The birth of electronic warfare. For Japan, it was a humbling reckoning. Their pilots, once feared for precision and courage, found themselves blinded not by fog or darkness, but by illusion. They had encountered a force that required no direct engagement, a war of ghosts, fought through frequencies and silence. In the decades that followed, historians would call it the invisible front, a prelude to the Cold War's shadow battles of signal interception, jamming, and espionage. But for those who lived through it, the pilots who chased phantoms, the sailors who trusted their radar only to find the ocean empty, it remained something more human. It was the moment the world learned that truth itself could be engineered. Every modern radar decoy, stealth bomber, and digital spoofing system carries the lineage of those experiments in the Western Pacific. The silent convoys, the ghost echoes, the men who vanished into radio static. And in that legacy lies a paradox, that even in the vast openness of the sea, war found a way to hide. The Japanese pilots who once stared into blank radar screens could not have known it, but they were witnessing the dawn of a new battlefield, one where light, sound, and information would forever become the front lines of human conflict.